Patch 1.7 saw the Blood God take on Azeroth. 1.8 saw the Emerald Nightmare strike out against us, and shortly after, players would face down the old god Cthulhu, but not before cracking open the Scarab Gate, a truly epic event that we covered in our last episode. It was an incredible moment in gaming, so you've got to check it out. It is great. Today, though, we face down the incredible raid content of ahn'qiraj, the overhaul of World of Warcraft's gear, and the gorgeous patch 1.10, Storms of Azeroth, the patch that likely has made your favorite ever transmog set. Welcome back to the complete history of Vanilla. This series is made possible by our patrons who can watch the next episode right now, plus get IRL loot. Yes, it's Dwarf and Hunter month on our Patreon, so you'll get all of the art for Dwarf and the Hunter pin, the first of this year's class pin set. They really do make this series possible. We thank them so much for it. And with that said, let's get in to patch 1.9. 1.7 Zul'Gurub performed incredibly for Blizzard, so adding another 20-man raid made perfect sense, and thus the Ruins of ahn'qiraj was born, a new raid that would help people on their journey towards 40-player content. It's also where we saw a new token gearing system via the Cenarian Circle sets, and this meant that people would have to get both the tokens and the rep to get the gear. Now, this was an odd set on purpose, actually being a cloak, ring, and weapon, and that was an intentional move from Blizzard so as to not mess up the other traditional set formats. Now, while this wasn't the main event as a raid, it undoubtedly was a very strong one. It supported a lot of memorable bosses and overall was a great way to get into the more serious content. General Rajax had been spotted during the gate opening, but Ruins, of course, would see players actually kill him. And he was quite the fight. He was a really grueling slog, with the key just being the length. Players had to be conscious of their mana and their consumables as they faced him and his 7 waves of minions. Well, you weren't exactly alone. You did have Lieutenant General Andronov and then 4 Night Elf elites helping you out. We've then also got Buru the Gorger, a giant bug that's another memorable boss, but mainly because he would wipe his aggro table from time to time. Now, the aggro economy of Vanilla was pretty darn tight, so it really required care, and well, that caused a lot of wipes. We've then got Assyrian, who was the final boss of the Ruins, and he was a really cool and absolutely vanilla design. So he'd begin the fight in Supreme mode, and this would give him a massive boost to his damage, but there would be resonating crystals that would spawn around him, and when you interacted with those resonating crystals, they would make him vulnerable to a particular school of magic, which of course is what provided the raid their path towards killing him. So with quality catch-up loot, other just flat out incredible pre-AQ40 loot, and importantly, just another source of loot in general, and of course a low drop per player ecosystem, it was a pretty essential counterpart to 40, but still, AQ40, the Temple of ahn'qiraj, was the main focus of this patch, and man, what a raid it was. The Temple of ahn'qiraj saw players descend into Cthulhu's titanic prison. It was a massive raid, providing the hardest content yet seen. Plus, it also had tier 2.5 gear and was tied to the Brood of Nozd'umu rep, progression with whom would actually net players a Bis ring that would increase an item level as they got their rep. As for 2.5, well, it certainly was an interesting look for the tier, one that I think was at least very much in theme for the raid. Prophet's Garam was up first, a fight with fairly interesting positional gameplay with its 3 different platforms, but otherwise one that was very much a first boss. Next though, let's skip ahead to the Silithid Royal family. This is a boss fight with a special place in WoW's history, being the first ever hard mode. Now the fight difficulty and reward would vary based on the kill order, and this really was an innovation in World of Warcraft design, but it's one that wouldn't be properly picked up on until Wrath of the Lich King, Sartharian and Ulduar raids. Past that though, well, we had the next boss, Battleguard Sartura, and that's one that had a notable hotfix because players who died during that fight, well, they quickly discovered that they could just simply respawn at the entrance and run straight back in. And yes, that meant that you could pretty much just brute force it with corpses. A door was actually installed to stop this from happening, but the exploit wasn't fully patched until patch 1.11. Another notable one is Visidius. Now, he must have been a mystery for players initially because he didn't take any damage, but it was soon discovered that frost effects and frost spells would slowly freeze him until he then shattered into 20 globs, which of course could be damaged. Next though, I want to skip to the twin Emeralds. Emperors, Bellular and ahn'qiraj. So ahn'qiraj, immune to spell damage, would have to be tanked very traditionally. Bellular, though, well, he was immune to physical damage, and that actually meant that a caster would have to tank them. A fairly interesting situation, fairly innovative. Now, the temple was also, of course, famous for its trash mobs, but none more so than those after the Twin Emperors. Raids would have to find a way to delicately pull them one group at a time, and a simple tactic saw hunters send their pet out to pull, and if two or more groups were aggroed, well, you'd feign death, reset, and try again. Now, another thing to note here is that this was a truly massive raid. It's one that was full of trash, and back in those days, of course, trash in raids respawned. So, yes, players certainly were killing a hell of a lot of trash. Still, though, Blizzard weren't purely evil, as they did give you the Kiraji resonating crystals, which would, of course, summon a mount, and those mounts could be used within the raid, which at least did help you get around the fairly massive complex. Of course, though, what we've covered thus far, well, it just pales in comparison to the majesty of the final boss. The reason we're all here, Cthulhu. At the time, old gods were suspected of being the most powerful villains in the Warcraft lore, and as such, players were expecting a fight to match that reputation, and well, that's pretty much exactly what they got. This is a fight that was, in the words of ahn'qiraj, mathematically impossible. Cthulhu would start by blasting his green eye beam at the first person who stepped into the room. It would then leap to any raid member close to that initial target, and funny enough, if done incorrectly, this could lead to a near instant wipe. Now, then the next consideration was the Eye of Cthulhu's second ability, Dark Glare. This shot from his eye would move in a 180-degree arc around the room, instantly killing anyone who came into contact with it. So, to organize, well, positioning was extremely essential here, and the raid would end up splitting into 8 groups of 5 spread evenly around the boss. That wasn't all, though, as when that was going on, Cthulhu would be spawning in his eye and claw tentacles, and these would need to be prioritized as soon as they spawn. So you'd be managing those mechanics, you'd actually do decently well, and eventually you would clear phase 1. You'd bust the eye open and reveal the unspeakable horror that was Cthulhu himself. Problem was, though, the shell of Cthulhu would reduce all damage taken by the old god by 99%. Now, the thing is that periodically he would then devour members of the raid. He'd pull them into the acid-filled pit that was his stomach that had one single exit. Now, there'd be 2 tentacles within. Now, they were there for defense, but ironically, they were his weakness, because if killed, the old god would fall into a vulnerable state. So, after being devoured, the tentacles would then be killed by players, and the players outside would unleash all that they had. Now, devoured tanks would have to exit immediately to get their aggro back. DPS players would have to, of course, focus the tentacles down, and then healers who were devoured would have to keep those DPS alive. And this was a decent bit of coordination for a vanilla-era raid. Rinse and repeat that a few times and you win. So, sounds easy, right? Well, I mean, maybe to the modern experience tactically, but the slight thing here is that, well, the boss was mathematically impossible upon launch. Yeah, to say that Blizzard learned a lot from this raid would be an understatement. Cthulhu was initially unkillable, with guilds having just completed the Gates of ahn'qiraj just smashing their collective heads against this fight 20 or 30 times inside a reset and just getting nowhere. Now, game director ahn'qiraj at that time was the guild leader of the guild elitist jerks, and at the time he was publicly calling Blizzard out on how hard that fight was. So between that, the 10-minute graveyard run to the final room, and the respawning trash, players, well, they had begun to lose their patience, and there was actually a sharp drop-off in raid participation. Now, this raid was introduced on the 23rd of January 2006, but because, of course, of the gate opening event that, check out last week's episode for, progression didn't actually start until February. Now, the nerfs required to kill Cthulhu were then not implemented until March, 80 days later. A few hours after those nerfs, though, a guild named Nihilim on the Magtheridin EU server got the world first, with American guilds following close behind. And overall, AQ40 highlighted the problems with 40-man raids for Blizzard Entertainment, and it was at this time that the development team actually decided to stop making 40-man content, although of course they did still have Naxxramas to ship. And this ultimately would set us towards the smaller player count and tighter boss designs that we now know today that have more personal responsibility. Patch 1.9 brought more than just raids in an event though. It also saw the linking of the auction houses. So yeah, before this, auction houses were actually local to their city, with Ironforge and Orgrimmar, of course, bias, that leading towards those cities being crowded and others being abandoned. Well, 1.9 linked all the auction houses within a faction, and that meant that all cities had their economies be linked, even the neutral goblin ones. So if you wanted less lag but still a viable auction house, well, 1.9 would give it to you. Now, in line with this, Blizzard also linked trade chat between all cities. Yes, that only came in 1.9. Also, raids were given a defined reset schedule, so the 40-man content would reset every 7 days during server downtime, barring Ahn'qiraj, which was every 5 days, and then of course the 20-man raids were every 3 days, and that made them pretty darn farmable. Now, that might seem overpowered in a modern context, but you've got to remember that the loot dropped per player in attendance was lower in vanilla than it is today. And then finally, many of World of Warcraft's most iconic armor sets, Tier 2, got their art update. A Paladin Judgment armor, that was this patch. Same for the Nemesis Warlock. Now, these art updates were a massive step up, further adding to the prestige of those who actually wore them. Really, lots happened in this patch, but it actually would not be that long until the next. Patch 1.10 Storms of Azeroth hit servers on the 28th of March 2006, bringing with it sweeping changes to itemization plus the titular Storms of Azeroth themselves. While not a massive content-driven patch, it actually did a hell of a lot for the game, setting up quite strongly for Vanilla's final stretch. Patch 1.10 released 16 months after World of Warcraft's launch, and it really does feel like Blizzard were starting to come to grips with how the endgame of WoW actually ended up working out. You see, WoW's endgame was cobbled together quite quickly before launch, so it's no surprise that balance and stats just started off in an odd place. Now, as an example of this increased understanding, the gear that dropped from ahn'qiraj, well, that would only have stats that was pertinent to a class's role, and as of this patch, the stat changes began to be retroactively applied to gear that was already in the game, with items such as the Wolf Runner's shoes dropping its plus 11 agility in exchange for an equipped effect of increasing damage or healing done by magical spells and effects by up to 13. Then further to this, the only practical way to progress a character after level 60 in World of Warcraft before this was through raiding, and that's a rather exclusive activity. So for players who couldn't actually make that leap into regular raiding, it could feel pretty much impossible to outfit their character in that epic gear. Well, patch 1.10 actually shook up itemization outside of raiding, with the most prominent addition being a fairly major thing, the all-new Dungeon Set 2. This opened up a series of quests for players to upgrade their existing Dungeon Set gear, and this is like some of the most iconic gear in the game. It was a major goal back then, and you'd upgrade it into different colored variations with higher stats. Importantly though, at least for the emotional side of things, the gear would go from blue to purple, and that meant a lot. Now, these quests not only expanded on the open world content of WoW, but they even added extra bosses to dungeons like Cormac the Ogre Necromancer. Now, this new power actually led to Dungeon Set 2 being known as tier 0.5 to players, and that means that, yeah, they actually did have respect for the power of that gear. Now, existing endgame dungeon loot tables were also made more attractive in this patch, with stats and drop chances actually being increased, and actually in a few cases, and this is wild, dungeon gear could actually win out against the first tier of raid gear, a bit of an odd situation. Then, as a final note, trinkets were given a cooldown equal to the length of their attached ability. Now, this was to stop some classes from being able to activate both of their trinkets and one-shot any opponent, and a very notable example of this was mages using Presence of Mind to instantly cast a Pyroblast, which, when buffed by 2 trinkets, could actually mean certain death to any other player hit. So, was this gear more accessible? Yes. Is that a bad thing? At this stage, I actually wouldn't say so, because the combination of Zul'Gurub, AQ20, and these dungeon changes, that really did provide a more clear path to progression. And that's something that, at least initially in vanilla, wasn't really ideal. And you've got to understand, like, just how many people dropped off between raid tiers, but really the story of that is a little bit more in the future, and we'll cover it when we hit Naxxramas. Patch 1.10 also brought the new weather system, and it was just wonderful. I mean, I still remember it to this day. Just the ASMR immersion that really placed you in the world, it can't be beaten. It is an incredible thing. There is nothing that will place you into Azeroth better than a really good weather soundscape. Blizzard understood that, and in this patch, they did it. Flight points were now seamlessly connected, and that actually meant that players could just go right to their end destination, rather than having to stop off after each flight. Yeah, in 1.10, Orgrimmar to Dassalis was one flight instead of 3. Then a rather funny Winter's Veil exploit was also fixed. It actually used to be that if a player was hit by a snowball as they started their flight path, well, they'd instantly teleport to their destination location. Pretty darn handy indeed. Also, players who unlearned a profession would now be able to choose a different specialization upon relearning that profession. And this was particularly handy for professions such as, say, engineering, I think, which is really the prime example here, where people could level up, say, gnomish engineering for the trinkets and the gear, and then level up goblin engineering for the on-use effect items. There was one sad thing though. Korak Blood Rager was finally removed from Alterac Valley along with the remaining Winterax trolls. This, plus a few other changes to the valley, pretty much signified the end of the iconic AV that many people remark upon to this day. So, rip Korak, but it's not like it would be the last we'd see of him. Paladins got their class review pass in 1.9, and the community, because of that, were expecting the Horde counterpart to the Paladin, the Shaman, to receive theirs. Now, considering the slower pace of raid progression for the Horde generally, players at the time believed that this was partially because of the utility provided by Paladins, so they were pretty much expecting a Shaman buff. Well, it didn't happen in 1.9, and 1.10 instead focused on the Priests. Shadow Form damage reduction was buffed, Holy Fire was taken off the talent system, Mind Soothe is now an instant, which was quite nice, then the unique racial abilities were also seen to, so Humans was redesigned as an anti-magic shield that burns the enemy's mana and inflicts shadow damage. The Undead's Touch of Weakness had its mana cost decreased and inflicted shadow damage against melee attacks. Then the Night Elves was actually reworked to be a damage over time spell that actually increased in effectiveness the longer that it was on its target. And then finally, the Hex of Weakness would now also decrease healing effects on the target by 20%. Now, that was the Priest, but as for the Shaman, what was hotly anticipated, what people really wanted, well, believe me, that's a story that we are going to get to in this series. But for now, that is it for patch 1.9 and patch 1.10. A truly epic situation with the first old god ever put into World of Warcraft, a mathematically impossible boss, and then us seeing Blizzard essentially overhaul so much of the gearing system in order to provide, I suppose, a more intentionally designed progression curve, as opposed to the, well, sort of cobbled together hodgepodge that was the vanilla launch. So there we go, that's it for this episode. Be sure to like, sub, and stay tuned for next episode next week. We are drawing close to the end of vanilla, but don't worry, there's going to be a lot more content where this is all came for. So thank you very much for watching this episode, and with that, I will see you next time.